Afternoon. Thank you so much, Tilak and the entire student cell at Nalsar for organizing this and inviting me. And I really appreciate the fact that all of you are willing to attend the session on a Saturday afternoon, just pre-lunch. Although I know nowadays there's not much difference between a Saturday, Sunday, and a Monday, even for us. So I'm Shubha. I graduated from Nalsar in 2006. I've been practicing corporate law for the last 14 years. My journey is a little bit different in the sense that, yes, I evolved from a typical transaction lawyer to an in-house counsel now. In my 9 years of career in the law firm, I worked on several, on both equity and debt matters. I advised clients on private equity transactions and project financing. So I really feel that this foundation that I had on where I had, worked on both equity and debt transactions, and of course did the normal general corporate advisory work, really helped me in learning competition law. So I'm not your typical law firm competition lawyer. I am an in-house counsel who has built expertise in competition law over the last 3 years. So it is in Aditya Birla Group that I built my expertise in competition law. So today, whatever I will be discussing, I'm going to be discussing it from an industry representative point of view, from a practical experience, from the cases that I have handled in the last 3 years at ABG. I will be discussing and sharing my experience and my views on certain legal issues in competition law. So what I thought is today I will be discussing, so at ABG, so I'll be discussing two aspects in competition law on which I have worked. And I thought I think it'll be helpful for you students to know how we at a corporate, as a corporate, and how we look at these issues, and how we have handled these practically, and what sort of changes that we want as a corporate counsel. At ABG, in the sense, in the last 3 years in competition law, I have worked on diverse cases. Basically my first assignment on competition law started with the whole Idea Vodafone merger application itself, the combination application. Then for about a year and a half till the merger was closed, I worked on monitoring the competition law compliance, in the during for the merger. Then I worked on the whole the Supreme Court case on the TRAI versus CCI, the jurisdictional issues. So worked on that from the High Court level to the Supreme Court level. And I've also worked with my business on abuse of dominance allegation against Grasim. Grasim is a manufacturing company of Aditya Birla Group. ABG as such is primarily a manufacturing conglomerate. So the two issues that I'm going to be discussing today, the first one would be on the role of the Director General. So the purpose of 26(1), what is a prima facie order, the role of a Director General in the investigation during the inquiry process of CCI, and the case laws that have come, whether I'll be discussing certain Supreme Court case laws, I'll be discussing Delhi and certain High Court case laws. And then after that, I will be discussing an issue under abuse of dominance. So what I thought is I'll give you a brief overview of abuse of dominance, like in terms of practical examples that I have seen, like how, let's say you have so many provisions, what are the factors that have to be considered before before an entity is considered to be dominant. So in that, how does CCI, what sort of parameters are considered, what sort of tests are applied, so I'll share whatever knowledge and experience that I have on that. And I honestly feel that at this stage where we are, it's 10 years of implementation of Competition Act, I think we need the appreciable adverse effect test to also be applied to Section 4, which is currently not there. So let me begin with the whole 26(1). Yeah. Can you all see the PPT?
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. Okay. So basically, see, competition law primarily has three important sections. One is your combination application section. The second one is your cartel or your anti-competitive agreements under Section 3. And third is your abuse of dominance. The other pillar of competition law is advocacy, to ensure that market practices are not anti-competitive and they promote fair competition. So that is also one of the responsibilities of Competition Commission of India. Now in this, how does the whole process start? I'm not sure how many of y'all know competition law, so I'll just briefly touch upon how the process starts, okay? So under section 19, so there is a departure in this particular Competition Act from the earlier regime to the extent that it is only CCI. So your Competition Commission of India can either suo moto, pick up a particular issue and initiate an investigation, or an information or complaint is filed under section 19, and that is when a complaint is started and initiated.
Ma'am,
So, yeah, what is this?
Can you just full screen the PPT here?
Okay, one second.
No, slideshow. Just put it on slideshow.
Yeah, got it.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you see it now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Is it now? You can see it now, right? The full screen?
No, ma'am. It's in the present tense mode, I think.
Okay, you also can see the present. Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Use slideshow. Yeah.
Okay, got it. Add some notes. So, okay, sure. Thanks. Now I think you can see the screen, right? Properly.
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. To start, basically at the complaint stage, okay, it's very so this is anybody can go file an information or a complaint. Last year an amendment had come, I think in August or September, which is very important from an industry perspective. So what was happening is a lot of forum shopping was happening, so typical commercial disputes. You have a disgruntled customer, he does not want to pay you the money, so what he'll do is he'll just go file a complaint in under Competition Act saying that, okay, this particular entity is indulging in either abuse of dominance or some sort of an anti-competitive agreement. And then as a company, as an industry player, you are just harassed with the whole ordeal of investigation and you have to go through it. So currently, there is no provision for a complainant to withdraw his or her complaint. So that is, I think, being suggested in the bill right now, in the amendment bill. I hope that comes through. So once an information is filed, the most important part of the inquiry is your section 26(1) prima facie order. Okay. So here, what is the prima facie order? We have the Supreme Court in SAIL, Steel Authority of India, CCI versus Steel Authority of India. It's a 2001 case law. So in that, Supreme Court has laid down certain principles. Basically, it said that 26(1) is your administrative order. Okay, so it is not, and also another thing that is important here is that this order is not appealable. What does that mean? 26(1) is, it's an administrative order. CCI will basically direct the DG to start investigation. Now, the main difference in the act here versus your MRTP regime is that earlier DG also had a suo motu power to start an investigation. But now that power has only been given to CCI, and DG is basically the investigative arm of CCI. Okay, so while giving a prima facie order, it's very important for CCI to record certain reasons, based on whatever materials are placed before it. So whatever information that the informant or the complainant files as part of its information, CCI is required to go through that information, analyze and give some preliminary findings as to why it thinks that, it's a preliminary view. Of course, it's not going to be a detailed one because a detailed view can only be formed once the DG completes its investigation. But CCI is required to give some basic reasons as to why it thinks there's a possible or a potential violation of either Section 3 or Section 4. Now here, I just want to spend like a minute on the Section 26(1), the whole non-appealable order bit. So here I'll discuss two cases. One is the recent, I'm sure y'all would have seen the whole Karnataka High Court stay that happened, which Amazon and Flipkart got against the CCI's prima facie order. So there was a second investigation order that CCI had passed. So Amazon and Flipkart approached the Karnataka High Court and they got a stay. Now, why is that you need to go to a high court? And simply because the statute does not provide for an appeal against your Section 26(1). So if an information is filed and CCI thinks that there is a potential violation, it thinks that there may be a violation of either Section 3 or Section 4. So then CCI will direct the DG to start investigation into the alleged violation. And section 26(2), if CCI thinks that no, there is no, that it doesn't see, it's actually a commercial dispute, or it does not see any merit in the allegations level, then CCI will not, will close that matter. Section 53A gives you a right of appeal against your section 26(2), but section 26(1) is non-appealable. So even in my, so this was like one of the first litigation cases that I started handling in competition law. This was the whole case about Jio. When Jio had launched in 2016 in September, in 2017, it filed, initially there was a lot of issue about the point of interconnection. So Jio alleged that all the three telcos, this is prior to Idea Vodafone merger, so Idea, Vodafone and Airtel separately at that point, basically Jio alleged that they denied points of interconnection. Okay, so CCI actually, this is something that I want to highlight from our practical experience, that CCI gave us a right of hearing. You know, so CCI allowed all the three telcos to approach CCI and present, you know, their case and saying that no, actually this act. Firstly, I think the most important thing that was presented was that. You know, so all the telcos, I mean, there was no such issue about not giving points of interconnection. Most importantly, this is a telecom regulatory issue. So TRAI is supposed to, you know, proceed on this, and once TRAI opines on this, that is when Competition Commission can actually do any sort of a further investigation. And here, I think one of the biggest reasons when we approached the Bombay High Court to get a stay, why did we get a stay at the Bombay High Court, similar to why did Flipkart get a stay, was one of the, for us, the most important reason as Idea why we got a stay is that we had a hearing before CCI. And in the prima facie order, right, so CCI is obligated to go through all the materials placed before. So it did not. So either CCI can say, okay, you know, for these reasons, we accept this material, or for these reasons, we don't see merit in this material that is placed before us. So CCI is supposed to come up with some sort of reasoning in that prima facie order. And since CCI did not do any of that, that was something that we had as a point of strength. And that was the basis, that was one of the strong grounds on which we got a stay. Another big ground that we got a stay on was because of the fact that any representation made through your industry association or trade association is not anti-competitive. Okay, so in the prima facie order, the reason why CCI said that you know, there is possible collusion or cartel between these three players against Jio was on the basis of the representations filed by the telecom, the COA, that is your Cellular Operators Authority of India. So all the representation that COA made to the government, CCI concluded that these representation amounted to cartel. So then we, so these are the two grounds on which we got a stay. And so as a lawyer, when you are advising your client, especially at a 26(1) stage itself, you know, so an investigation is not something, especially an investigation under Competition Act is not something that, you know, it's extremely good for the company. And it's actually, the shareholders get very apprehensive. It sends out a lot of negative messages. So genuinely, if there is, if it is one of those frivolous litigations, or you have a disgruntled customer just trying to do forum shopping using Competition Commission, you can, I mean, you have to, of course, evaluate this on a case-to-case basis. And that's something that you can decide. You know, you do have an option at the prima facie order stage itself to seek a stay on that investigation in case, you know, there is no merit in that. That's an avenue that you can definitely try on. Now, moving on, after your 26(1) investigation, so what is, so once the CCI passes a prima facie order, the entire DG the whole investigation, the process of investigation by DG kicks in. Okay, at this point, I want to discuss the provisions of the Director General, the Section 41 under Competition Act, and a few case laws which have come where they have talked about what is the powers of the Director General under Competition Act. I'm sorry, I haven't put the citations here, but maybe I can share it with the student. I mean, these are all really popular cases, but if you want, I can share the citations after the presentation. Now, in terms of DG's investigation power, the Act is very clear. DG's role and scope is to assist the Competition Commission. DG is supposed to investigate. So Section 26(1) clearly says DG is supposed to investigate into the matter. Okay, and Section 41 also clearly lays down that DG's role is supposed to assist the Competition Commission of India. This is also reiterated in the SAIL case, which is a Supreme Court case. I mean, to say that SAIL is basically your holy Bible on Section 26(1). So if you, in terms of interpret, it's post SAIL, so all the other cases draw and refer to SAIL and mostly reiterate the same position. But the role, what is the meaning and purpose of 26(1) as an administrative order, or the need for CCI to give certain preliminary reasons was laid out in SAIL. Supreme Court also talked about DG's role and powers in SAIL. Now, I want to discuss Excelcrop and Cadila, both of these cases. Now, here what happened is that in Excelcrop, it's a bid rigging case. This was about some agricultural products. I think so CCI, when it passes your prima facie order, also gives you the period of investigation to the DG. Okay, so usually informant will allege that during this time, this anti-competitive agreements were, like say for instance, bid rigging. So they will say, the informant will allege that for these years that the tenders were submitted, there were, I mean, all these parties colluded and indulged in bid rigging. So then CCI will ask the DG to investigate in those particular years. In Excel Crop Care case, so CCI, I mean, as you all know, Competition Act was enforced in 2009. It's been 10 years of competition law. And in Excel Crop Care case, what happened was that DG was asked to investigate, I think, for a period between 2009, like for about 4 to 5 years. And there was, what DG found during its investigation is that the additional year, so a year beyond the scope of the prima facie order also, and that year also these parties indulged in bid rigging. So DG included that particular year and also concluded that for all these years, these parties have indulged in bid rigging. So one of the grounds taken as an appeal against this when it came to Supreme Court, what is the power of DG? So to what extent can he stretch while doing his investigation? So Supreme Court was clear when it said that when a DG is investigating into a matter, so if there is a plus or minus, so here please remember that the investigation was into a violation under Section 3. So if there is, what DG basically said, what the court, basically said that if it is within DG's powers to investigate, if there is a violation of 4 years, beginning from 2006 to 10, an additional year of 11, which DG finds that parties continue to behave in that way, then DG is free to add that into its investigation period. That was the issue in Excel Crop. In Cadila, which is it's a Delhi High Court case. This case is sub judice right now. Okay, so here this is about again some sort of a collusive agreements that were entered into certain pharmaceutical entities. Cadila was not initially a party. Was not one of the parties as part of the prima facie order. But in the prima facie order, Supreme Court said that by the prima facie order, the CCI asked the DG to look into and also see if any additional parties, if anybody else, to look into the matter, and if anybody else is also indulged in such collusive agreements, then please add them. And hence DG added Cadila as an additional party, and Cadila has appealed. So right now this matter is sub judice in the Supreme Court. And I will talk about the last case that I want to discuss here is the Grasim High Court. This is a division bench order which came out in last August, September. And here, basically, in this case, what happened in this, I was involved directly and I worked on this case. So in this case, basically what happened was that the informant alleged a violation of Section 3 against all man-made fiber players. Okay, so that could be everybody who was manufacturing man-made fibers. That is your polyester makers, then there was viscose staple fiber, acrylic, and nylon. So DG, while investigating in Section 3 violation, also found that there was a violation of Section 4. So DG concluded, and then Grasim filed an appeal, filed a writ against this, filed a application before CCI saying that this is outside of the powers of, outside the scope of the prima facie order. DG does not have power to do this. And we had a single judge in our favor, and then the CCI appealed against the single judge order before a division bench of the Delhi High Court. So the division bench of the Delhi High Court ruled that the DG has the power to investigate into both Section 3 and Section 4 violations during the period of investigation. Now, this is where I have a problem. So the purpose of a prima facie order is that CCI has looked into it and CCI thinks there is a violation under, if CCI said there's a violation only under section 3, then can DG go and increase the scope and go ahead and investigate into section 4 violations. And the recent, I mean, that's something. So right now this is pending before the Supreme Court. We will have to see. But in my view, that is completely outside the power of the DG, power of the DG and the construct of the act. The way the act is constructed is to in such a way that the DG is basically an assistant to CCI. So once the CCI gives you a direction, to investigate into a particular matter, you look into the matter, you of course gather facts, gather evidence, gather your depositions, gather all sorts of documents and data in relation to that violation. So, and around it. So, but it can't mean that DG has such a wide power that he can jump from section 3 violation into a section 4 violation. And the recent amendment, I think, which was made in February 2020, before the entire, I think before the world went topsy-turvy. So in this amendment here, so what they said is that the DG report will contain all findings together with evidence collected during investigation. Now here it's important because earlier the language used to read that DG report will contain findings against each of the allegations leveled in the information or the reference. But now it's been made wide enough to say all findings together. I hope this will be read to mean, read in accordance with section 26(1), where basically the power flows, so it starts from there, the source of the entire investigation, which ends in, so section 26(1), if you see, the last line basically says that CCI is of the opinion that there exists a prima facie case. It shall direct the DG to cause an investigation to be made into the matter. So I hope this amendment is read together along with this section, such that DG investigates only into whatever is the allegations or the directions that are given in the prima facie order. This should not mean that DG can go ahead and investigate into, it starts with a section 3 and it ends in a section 4. So that sort of extension of the power, to my mind, should not be allowed. But we'll have to wait and watch. And also because all these cases are pending, like the Karila case is pending in Supreme Court, the Grassing case is pending in Supreme Court. So we'll have to see as to what view that the court will take eventually on these particular decisions. Yeah. Now I will move to the next part of my discussion. I'll take all questions at the end of the discussion. The second part that I want to discuss, where I've been working on extensively, is the entire abuse of dominance in the absence of an AEC test or an injury test, or whatever is a competitive disadvantage. It's not mandatory under the act. And why I think it's important. Before that, I just thought I'll just discuss what is abuse of dominance, what are the tests laid down, and from a practical standpoint, what are the parameters that CCI considers while delineating a relevant market or while looking into any abuse of dominance case. So abuse of dominance is governed by Section 4 of the Competition Act. There is a 3-step test which is laid down under the Act. The first test is delineation of relevant market. Now, this, as a competition lawyer, is one of the most important exercises that you take. Okay, so if you have delineated your relevant market correctly, you can think that you won half your battle. The next step is, of course, once the relevant market is determined, how is the enterprise dominant or not in that particular market? And once it's established that a particular enterprise is dominant, then you look at that conduct of that enterprise to determine whether it is abusive or not. So typically abusive conduct is either exclusionary or exploitative. So exclusionary conduct would be having exclusive tie-in arrangements or something, and exploitative would be excessive pricing or unfair conditions. So all of this. One more thing to note, in Section 4 of the Act, the way the Act is drafted, contrary to, let's say, EU jurisdiction, is that under your European competition law, the list of abusive activities is not exhaustive. Whereas in Section 4, you have 4 to 5 activities which have been listed and which has said that these are per se abusive, so the per se rule has been incorporated, and it is also an exhaustive list under the Indian Competition Act. Moving on. Here, I think, so I just thought as I said, I'll be briefly discussing relevant market and your dominant test. Firstly, as part of relevant market, as I don't know if you all have read it, but basically there's a proposed amendment, okay, in the 2020 to add this subclause 2, which I think is a welcome move. So I'll just discuss what is relevant market. As a relevant market comprises of both relevant product market and relevant geographic market, okay. As part of product market, it will comprise of all those products and services that are primarily substitutable or interchangeable. So what does that mean? So I'll give you a few examples. When are two products considered to be interchangeable or substitutable? The most common example that you will hear is that of matchbox and lighters. Okay, so irrespective of the cost, if there's a slight increase in the cost of matchbox, I mean, all consumers will automatically go and start buying lighters, and they will not think a minute, So, whether irrespective of the cost, so it's the cat, and the important part here is the physical characteristics are completely different, So, your matchbox looks and feels completely different. A lighter is made of different. It's comprised of a different chemical composition, made differently. But the end use, it serves the same purpose, and it's both. And since both are similarly priced, I mean, I'm talking the basic one. And the price is irrelevant here because of the end use. Both are easily substitutable. I'll give you another example of substitutable. Is that off late? I have worked. I think in the last years I've worked a lot in terms of telecom and viscose staple fiber. So I'll be giving a lot of examples from both textiles and telecom sector. I mean, that's where I have worked a lot. Now, in terms of telecom also, like you can see, basically what happened is thanks to internet. Now, earlier we had voice calls. Okay, so voice was when we started, like basically when landline started, there was literally a wire that went from one phone to the other. That's how we started telephones. And then you had the whole wireless technology just to connect voice. But now, internet is such a huge platform, and entire applications that have developed. Voice has now become an app. Okay, so if let's say I don't have a voice signal, I mean, which actually happens most of the time now, that signal, there's so much call drop. All of us have easily shifted to doing a WhatsApp call, or Skype call, or any of the voice calling over an app. Okay, so we also use video calling and voice calling. So this substitutable. So these two products are easily substitutable simply because of the end use. So it serves the purpose. I need to make a call, I can make a call, whether I make it through voice or whether I make it through internet. And another big advantage that we've had in India is because internet has become so cheap, the price, So even though internet and a voice call, the characteristics are completely different, because of the price and because of the end use, it serves the same purpose. Both have become easily substitutable. I can give you one more example would be in terms of textile, So in the last few years that you see as fashion trends, sportswear has picked up a lot, So that's become a massive fashion trend to sportswear. Like everybody wears track pants and t-shirts and we go out. And I'm not sure how many of you all noticed, but sportswear now primarily is made from polyester. How did polyester penetrate into the sportswear market? So the initial inhibition, or the reason why, especially in a tropical country like India, why did we not use polyester? One is this entire reason of lack of moisture management. Okay, so polyester does not absorb moisture, whereas cotton absorbs moisture. And the second reason why polyester was not used a lot was because of its environment reasons. It's not biodegradable. But now, due to technological advancements and the innovation that has happened in terms of fiber, in terms of what you can do with it, polyester actually is able to absorb, I mean, I wouldn't say like it absorbs your moisture, but then it has these wicking properties, So it is made now in such a way that it's actually suitable for sportswear where, there's maximum of moisture, like the water, like the sweat generation that happens. So because of its characteristics, and the fact that it's end use, it gives you the use, the comfort, the fall, the feel, the drape, the luster that is required, it's somewhere. And now you have polyester. I've actually seen this polyester. There's such a new form of polyester which looks like cotton. Okay, so you really don't understand the difference between polyester and cotton. And when viscose staple fiber was invented post Second World War, it was basically to substitute cotton. It was invented as a substitute for cotton. And viscose is made from pulp, whereas polyester is made from petroleum. So in spite of it, and because viscose can give you the same features as cotton, people started using viscose greatly. But you'll also see that in terms of fashion, in terms of substitutable or interchangeable, the end use matters a lot. Okay, so here, what is important is that because of let's say the blends, I'm not sure how many of you actually notice your tag, the cloth tags. If you do notice, you will see that there's a lot of let's say if I would talk about men's blazers or any of our blazers, on suits that we buy, you'll see that it'll have a mix of both polyester and viscose. So viscose to give you that comfortable feeling, and polyester because it's easy maintenance, and that's part of fast fashion, right? Easy maintenance is one of the biggest criteria of consumer, and polyester is able to give you that, and that's how polyester is easily substituted cotton and viscose staple fiber. Okay, so I'm just giving you examples to show that what sort of products have been considered to be easily substitutable. The second subclause, the production, which is proposed to be added, I think it's a great thing. So basically what is happening is that because of technological innovation, like a manufacturer so he doesn't have to stick to the same product while manufacturing. The best example that I can give you, especially during COVID times, is a lot of alcohol industries are now manufacturing sanitizers. A lot of garment industries are manufacturing your masks and protective gear and all of that. So with slight minimum or zero cost, manufacturer or supplier is able to switch production. This is one. So this is also something we see in spinning. So when I say spinning, a spinner is a person who manufactures yarn. So basically there's fiber, the cotton that grows, or a viscose staple fiber. That fiber is made into yarn. So at the yarn level, now the spinning technologies have advanced to such an extent that a spinner can easily switch now. So a spinner who makes cotton yarn can now easily make polyester yarn, and that within no time, with minimal cost and within hardly any time, a spinner is able to make these yarns. So then for that particular spinner, who is selling his products, he actually can change. He actually then has a wide gamut of products to sell, right? So you can be selling. He doesn't have to be restricted to a cotton yarn, but he can also sell both cotton and polyester, or blended yarn. It gives them so many more possibilities. So many more products then can be supplied by this one particular entity. So I think this is a very welcome change, and it's good in light of the technological advancement that's happening across sectors. So technology is changing the way we do business, and this, I think, is a very good amendment that's coming. Moving on, I just want to briefly discuss the factors that determine relevant market. Okay, so when you are determined, so in most cases in CCI, okay, on the geographic market part of it, most cases in CCI jurisdiction is limited to India. So if you are exporting outside of India, and the price that you charge and whatever, however the kind of contracts that you negotiate with your customers as a client, all of that falls outside of CCI's jurisdiction. Now, in terms of relevant product market, as I was discussing, the Act provides for certain factors. So how do you determine a relevant product market? Of course, it comprises primarily of your interchangeable and your substitutable goods, but it also provides you a list of other factors. So, for instance, I'll just go through them briefly under Section 19.7 and 19.6, which talks of relevant geographic market. To start with the product market, in 19.7, the first thing, physical characteristics end use, that as I was discussing, right? So when you have two particular products, it could be completely different. They're two different products, but serving the same end use. They can be easily substitutable, as all the examples that I discussed. Now, price. Now here, the price is of course a very important criteria, and especially for an Indian consumer, price is a huge touch point. Right? It's a very touchy topic. So the moment any particular goods, like, you can see that if the price increases, like actually if you see in textiles now, pure cotton, pure silk, pure wool have become super expensive. Okay, so Just give me 1 second. Just 1 second. I'm sorry, like the doorbell rang. I had to attend that. Okay, sorry. I was discussing the relevant product market here, and the different factors that CCI takes into consideration while defining a relevant product market. Now, I think I was talking about price. So price is a huge touch point. Like for instance, now in cotton, I give you an example. So pure cotton is now really expensive. Okay, so and you obviously we can see that now it's being substituted by blended fabrics, whether it's polycotton or a polyviscose, which gives you the same end use of that of a cotton. Even in a country like India, it's actually become, and they're cheaper, much cheaper, because polyester is very cheap. And is in fact the newest thing in the market is called recycled polyester. Okay, so the pure polyester is actually more expensive, and the recycled polyester comes very cheap. So even polyester players are finding it tough to compete with recycled polyester. So a recycled polyester, once either blended or the way it is processed, after processing the fabric, the way it comes out, it really looks like cotton, feels like cotton. Or, and it comes, you have all these, how do you say, this artificial silk, it is called. So all these things that have come, so it replaces, so for a consumer, and because of the way the trends are, it's fast fashion. Nobody wants to repeat things for more than two or three times maximum. And hence, all these kind of products also are finding a huge market. And in India, I think one of the biggest issues that we have is having an unorganized market. So we do have a huge unorganized market. So the data becomes very difficult to collect. The data we have is obviously only for the organized market and whatever is reported and which is available at the public websites or to statistic collecting organizations. But the real data, and you can't say, especially in India, that this is the complete data, simply because of the huge unorganized sector that we have. Okay, coming to, I think I was discussing about consumer preferences, which I did discuss in terms of textile, and even like you can even say telecom, or the broadband, right? The whole thing of cable TV, broadband or cable TV, of course. So earlier, cable TV was so restrictive. You had to sit in your house, you had to have that set-top box. It was, you were glued to your TV, and you had to pay subscription. You had to take only what was offered to you. But now, because of the entire OTT, the platform, and because everything has become an app, so everything is available online, and the entire online streaming habit of people has completely changed, the entire dynamic. So cable TV set-top boxes are now a thing of passing. Like there is no, in fact now, because TVs, like I have a TV where the set-top box is inherent, inbuilt in that, so the entire set-top box manufacturer, what happens to that industry, so what do you do, what is the next product? So that kind of, so in the, how do you determine a product market in that context is very important. Now existence of I'm talking about another, this thing is existence of specialized producers. Okay, so here I'd like to give you an example of, let's say, your automobile parts. Okay, it's one of the most easiest ones, one of the most easy, and I think something that we all understand. And there's also a case going on where the definition of relevant market has been very narrowly defined by CCI. So in the auto parts case, basically what CCI said that, of course, as we all know, right? So each automobile maker, like a Honda, will only if you have a Honda car, or like I have a Skoda car, so I can only go to a Skoda showroom or a service center and get either parts or services. I cannot go to any other like any other car maker. I can't go to a Honda. I cannot, of course, I can't go to a Maruti. So that exclusivity sort of an arrangement that these automobile makers have, and also they're specialized producer. How are they specialized in the sense? Yes, it sounds the same, whether it's the engine and the nut and bolt, but I can't put a Honda nut into my Skoda car. That's just not possible. So to that extent, then I have no choice but to be dependent on such part maker. And so I can also give you another example here is about Scott Glass. Okay, so here this is also a case on abuse of dominance. It's one of those, I think, a really good, well-reasoned case by Compat that is there on abuse of dominance. Now, in this particular case, Scott Glass was a very special. It's a German entity. A parent entity is in Germany. They had a manufacturing entity in India. What they manufacture is for all your liquefied drugs, right? So for your vials, your ampules, your test tubes, all that glass is what they manufacture. So it has to be as per certain specifications which are given by the US FDA. It has to comply with that. So somebody who manufactures that specialized particular product, so then the customer is completely dependent on that particular manufacturer. Unless you have at least 10 suppliers, or the import cost is equal to the cost of is lesser. I mean, either import cost has to be lesser than your domestic purchase cost. That is when you can go and import. Or you have multiple suppliers, you have a lot of choice. But if you don't have a choice, then you are completely dependent. And so then the relevant market will be defined only to mean that specialized glass entity. So CCI has taken in terms of defining, and lastly, the classification of industrial products. You have your national industrial classification codes, so across the world also, like for instance, textile, right? BISFA, it's a international body. It's based in France. So they kind of categorize different products, okay, in textiles. So you have man-made fibers, your natural fibers. In man-made fibers, you have so many kind of products. There's polyester, nylon, acrylic, all of that. So how do you categorize all of that? Would then be so you have different trade bodies giving you different definition of industrial products, because there's so many products within products. So the classification, so what we rely on, especially in India, is your national industrial classification. Now, moving on to relevant geographic market. So you have certain, so typically CCI does restrict it to India, as I was saying. But in certain cases, like for instance, in in real estate, in this DLF case about luxury flats, it said that it's a luxury market restricted to that geography, because it was present in Delhi and the other areas, it was limited to that. So that sort of a geographic market can also be drawn. For instance, if I were to take consumer, like Alfonso mangoes, which are so specialized, so unique to that geographical area. So then the market would then only be in Alfonso mangoes grown in that particular area. Or if I were to take like, Pochampalli saris, which come from Pochampalli in Andhra Pradesh. And so then the geographic market would only be in that particular area where these products are manufactured. So this is how these are like certain examples that I have come across while dealing with this. So, yeah. Moving on. Yeah. Okay. Moving on. The next thing is, once you determine relevant market, the next most important thing is figuring out, is this enterprise dominant or not? Is this enterprise dominant in that particular market or not? So I just thought I'll just go through the factors. These factors are listed out in section 19(4) of the Competition Act. The way so I think one of the most popular tests is your market share. Okay, so across abuse of dominance cases, you will see that CCI has applied this market share test. I mean, of course, it considers all factors, but primarily, like your market share is one of the most is one of the first thing. Like even when you talk about abuse of dominance, and you're like, okay, the first question as a lawyer, if I'm asking my business team, that okay, in this business, which is sector, what is our market share? So if you are a chemical manufacturing, if you're manufacturing caustic soda, so I'd be like, okay, what is the caustic soda? What is our market share in the caustic soda market? So that's the first thing. So one thing that's important here is to know that we don't have the bright line test. What is a bright line test? Basically means that if you have a market share of more than 50%, then there's an assumption of dominance, so that you presume that yes, you are a dominant player simply because you own more than 50% of the market share. So you can see that in your, let's say it's Amazon or Flipkart or like even your Asian Paints. I think recently in Jan, there's an investigation that has been initiated into Asian Paints. So Asian Paints owns, I think, close to more than 50%. And the second best paint player is your Berger Paints. So of course there are other paints after that. So I think one of the allegations was that Asian Paints has created certain entry barriers, and investigation has been initiated into that. But market share, so this, we don't have a bright line test, but CCI also, I mean, of course, it doesn't only rely on market share. It looks at all other factors while coming to a conclusion whether a particular enterprise is dominant or not. The second factor that is listed is your size and resources of enterprise. Okay, so you have, so if there is a size in terms of size and resource, right? Like your Google or an Amazon, which are so diversified, or let's say your local, our Indian companies, our Indian conglomerates, the Tata, Birla, and Ambani, all of them are so diversified and their size, right? They have resources, they have factories across India. So for them, they have a diversified business portfolio, so they'll always have an advantage to move from one, I mean, to set up another particular new thing, or let's say they want to get into a startup space, they want to get into any, let's say Tata got into an aviation space, it's pretty easy for that, for an entity like Tata to get into something like aviation. The next thing is size and importance of competitors. So while, when CCI is basically assessing your dominant position, it looks at what is the size. When you have so many resources at your free disposal, the assumption is that then there is an assumption of dominance, right? Because then the bargaining power of your customers is that much lesser vis-a-vis you, who's such a big player in the market. So, sorry. The third factor, it would be size and importance of your competitors. The more the number of players, I mean, the better it is for your client. Okay, so the lesser the number of players, then it becomes that much more difficult to prove that you are not a dominant player. So you have many more players. You have imports also, so there is access to imports. So basically, as a customer, if you have a choice in the market, that I have a choice to go to at least 5 players, or I can import, so when I have that kind of a choice, so that is considered to be a fair and a healthy market. Sorry. Okay. The next thing is about vertical integration. The best example that I can give you is that of Netflix. Okay, so Netflix started off as a DVD rental company, and today, basically, see, Netflix is what it offers you a platform. It ties up with producers for them to showcase their content. Okay, so now you also have, right, like so Netflix also has its own original production, which it showcases on its own platform. So it is vertically integrated, so vertical integration then would be that integration across all stages of your supply chain, so of your production, supply, sales. So you are present at each stage, at raw material stage, at the production stage, you are present at the sales stage, at the distribution stage, and finally, I mean, distribution, and finally at the sales stage, so when you're present across in all stages of the business, so that's when you're considered to be vertically integrated. So if you do have vertical integration, that completely goes against you, and yes, that will be considered as a dominant player. So yeah, I mean, so for the best example would be Netflix that I can give you. Dependence of consumers. I think this is something I was talking about, like the Scott Glass or others. When you manufacture something very niche, very unique, and you are the only player, then the dependence of customers on your products is very high. So then obviously that is considered in a negative light. That it also, of course, establishes dominance, because if you increase price, so you can, because then you become so powerful, you can control the demand, supply, you can fix price, and there's always a presumption that there will be an indulgence in excessive pricing or discriminatory conditions, or then you can force your customers not to just buy your product, but ask them put in any tie-in arrangements, or really indulge in exploitative practices. Legal monopoly, so best example is your railways power, so it's completely governed by the government of India. But having said that, Competition Act applies to these government entities also. If they have indulged in any sort of an anti-competitive activity, CCI will look into that. So, I mean, there was a recent case against ONGC in terms of those gas supply agreements, but also, of course, CCI looked into those cases and it said that there's nothing, there was no abuse of dominance by ONGC. But the point to be noted is that these entities, just because they're government entities or they are monopolistic, or they're the only thing, doesn't mean they go scot-free, So that is something. Entry barriers. Now, this is another very important criteria that CCI looks into while determining dominance. Okay, so one of the, in terms of, are there regulatory barriers, or as a player, are you creating entry barriers? So suppose if I, as I mean, if I think I'll just talk about the Asian Paints example, the case on the investigation that has been initiated. So one of the allegations by this new entrant is that it's a new entrant, Asian Paints, and of course Burger Paints are long established and one of the big players in the market. They are not allowing this person to enter the market. Okay, so in terms of so that is it. If that is true, so basically, what was the allegation is that Asian Paints is not letting this guy, basically telling its dealers that you cannot deal with anybody else but Asian Paints. So having those exclusivity sort of tie-ups, or foreclosing the market, or the supplier, any such sort of an activity would be considered. I mean, if you have such power, I mean, you have power, and you can, if they dominant enterprise. Coming up to so relative advantage. So here, relative advantage, I'll discuss Satteri's example. So Satteri is an international player. It's an international player in the viscose staple fiber segment. So Satteri is a huge pulp provider. Okay, so Satteri has massive eucalyptus trees. So viscose is made from pulp, wood pulp, usually taken from eucalyptus trees, or or there are certain other special trees that whose pulp is taken to make viscose staple fiber. So relative advantage. If I am a pulp maker, how difficult is it for me to set up a fiber plant? I can just immediately set up a fiber plant. And uh, so that is what is relative advantage. Okay. The next thing would be economic power, or commercial advantage, market size, structure. So all these are things like, for instance, a person, for instance, so simple example would be like telecom, right? Like how Reliance entered from being a petrochemical company, it entered into a telecom. So it had the economic power, commercial advantage, and it entered into a new industry altogether. So these are all factors. These are kind of considerations that are taken into account by CCI while determining whether a enterprise is dominant or not. So while I was discussing these factors, so basically once these two tests are passed, okay, you've determined your relevant market, you've also determined that ABC player, is a dominant enterprise. So then what happens? Okay, so then you look at the activity. Okay, what are so activities could be in terms of price. See, most popular dominant abuse, abuse of dominance is in terms of your pricing and discounts. So either it's excessive pricing, or it's discriminatory pricing. So I'll have two customers buying the same product, but then I will charge different prices to different customers. Okay, so that is one of the most it's an exploitative kind of abuse. So it's a very basic example that I'm giving you. But having said that, in evolved jurisdictions like EU, I mean, I will be discussing that in my next slide when I discuss why we need a AEC test right now under Section 4. But basically, say evolved jurisdiction and competition law has held that discriminatory pricing per se need not, it isn't bad, unless you can show that because of the discriminatory pricing, there is actually disruption in the market, or the downstream players have been affected massively. Okay, so when okay, I think there's a question. I'll take all the questions at the end of the session. Yeah. So discriminatory pricing per se is not bad, but if you can show that there is harm at the to the downstream players, so that is when it becomes abusive. So there is a twofold test now, which is laid down in the European law. We don't have that test. It's not for us. We are yet. I mean, I'll discuss that in a bit. Let me just finish giving these examples. So any sort of like limiting or restricting or denial of market access. So like I think one of the examples is like your whole Google case, right? Abuse of dominance by Google, and in terms of its search words and all of that, because Google controls YouTube, Google controls, so the moment you type in any search word, it'll show up whatever entities or ads of people who it is interested. So a supplier whose ad comes on a second or a third page has no chance. I mean, I as a customer, I'm not going to the second or third page on the search engine, So then they lose out, and that is primarily the case of abuse of dominance against Google. And also it's somewhere it's denial of market access, right? So you, I mean, if my ad is not, if nobody knows where that I exist, then how do I even get into the market? In terms of supplementary obligations, this is a very interesting. This is a very interesting clause, because you do have, you know, like for instance, if you have a dominant player, like suppose if I'm the only one, who let's say I'm an antivirus, you know, provide, I give an antivirus application software, I sell that. So with an antivirus, I say that no, you also have to buy my entire new format of Word and Excel or something like that, completely disconnected. I came to you buy antivirus software, but then you are selling me completely different things. So such sort of imposing such obligations onto a customer would definitely be considered as abusive. Um, okay, so now I'll discuss the whole point of absence of competitive disadvantage. So in my opinion is that this is also that in terms of the competition review committee, Raghavan committee, so I just discussed the whole point of the harm test. Okay, so the way Competition Act is constructed, Section 3 incorporates within itself an AEC test. So what is an AEC test? Is an appreciable adverse effect. So there has to be an adverse effect on the market, you know. So there has to be some sort of harm or an injury or a disruption in the market, and that is when it is anti-competitive. Okay. Whereas right now, the Section 4 is basically a per se rule. So what is the per se rule? It basically means that if I charge two different prices to, I sell, let's say I sell mangoes, okay, so, and the same mangoes I sell to two customers at two different prices, you know, so per se that's abusive. If I am the only mango, seller in the market, and I'm considered to be a dominant player in light of all the factors that we discussed, so then any sort of sale to customers at a different pricing, that is discriminatory pricing, and that's it. Per se, that is treated as abusive. So currently, that is how the act is drafted. The second leg of this discrimination, you know, so actually how much damage does this cause? So this becomes very important in a B2B segment. Okay, so if I'm an input material, I am, let's say, I manufacture, let's say I'm talking in context of viscose staple fiber. Okay, so I manufacture fiber, I sell it to a spinner who makes yarn, you know. So, and this is typical in any B2B, manufacturing setup, where you do have, where there will be different prices that are charged. Okay, so there will be discounts given. There may be, so I'm not, so if for I'm not talking about different price. I'm not talking about discriminatory pricing in equivalent transactions, but I am talking about, different pricing. I mean, okay, sorry, that's my alarm clock. Okay, so what I'm talking about is that, just give me a minute. Yeah, so dissimilar treatment to equivalent transactions and harm to competition or likely harm to competition in the sense that the buyers suffer a competitive disadvantage against each other, leading to competitive injury in the downstream market. So if these two tests are fulfilled, that is when I think it should be treated as an abuse of dominance. So the way our markets are evolving, you know, and the way, and this is also, so earlier, even in the EU jurisdiction for a long time, it was the per se approach that was taken, but they moved on to the rule of reason. Okay, so it's not just a discriminatory pricing, but it's also the effect of it. It is actually natural. So once you start dealing with business teams, you'll realize that in a business, everybody has it. Everybody will have your top 20 customers. You will have your loyalty discounts. You will have, you know, some sort of discount. Let's say a customer has is innovating. Let's say a new startup is trying to tie up with you because they're innovating. They're trying to come up with a new innovation using your product, then you will give them some sort of a discount, because if that innovation does take off, you are looking at a future profit. So at that point, maybe you will sell your product at a lesser cost to this particular purpose, to this particular customer, for because the use is different, you know. So if as a business I'm not allowed to charge different discounts, and I'm not allowed to have a pricing, if I can negotiate a price with the customer on fair terms, on objective terms, on based on whatever, on the whole on demand, supply, on transport cost, on my raw material cost, based on all these objective criteria. If I'm not able to if I'm not allowed to negotiate my price, then that is somewhere hampering me as a business person to conduct my own business, you know. So that is, forget, it's not, I mean, you may be, so one end of one responsibility, let's say CCI has, is of course consumer interest, you know, but it also has an equal responsibility to protect and promote competition within the market. So I just discussed these cases. So in your European Union, right, in these particular cases, or EMEA versus Autorita. So in this case, what happened was that here, even, I mean, the price was, I mean, even though the price was different, you know, so they did have different prices. The EU looked into the fact that what is the harm? Is there an injury to the downstream players or not? So it really established that if there is no harm or injury caused to the downstream players, that is not abuse of dominance. Similarly, in Hoffman La Roche, so here I think this is a very important case in terms of fidelity discounts. Okay, so see, we have seen, I mean, there is always this presumption that, you know, loyalty discounts are bad, they are abuse of dominance. But every businessman will have loyalty discount, whether it's your Kirana store guy to any big player. Everybody wants to retain its customers, right? If so, which also helped me. So I know these are my top 30 customers. I will give them loyalty discounts in order to retain them and to ensure that they don't go to anybody else. That is just a sound business practice. That is not abusive or discriminatory in any way. So basically in the EU, what happened is, post your Intel case, here both, so EU, what they have decided, and now it's all, I mean, generally all jurisdictions, let's say your UK, Canada, Australia, all these jurisdictions also follow the effects-based approach even for Section 4. So in this particular approach, what they want to see is that, not so, for exclusionary, effects based has been made mandatory post the Intel case. For exploitative, if the party asks for it, the commission has to look into it. Okay. And the effects based approach was also recommended in the Raghavan committee report, which is the first committee report on competition law. The recent your competition law review committee report that, you know, came out last year, they concluded that CCI has been applying this on an ad hoc basis. It's on a case-to-case basis, you know. So because the EU Commission has basically said that for exclusionary abuses it's mandatory, for exploitative it is kind of discretionary, you know, it's just not a compulsory thing. So what the CLRC concluded, that decisional practice. So here I'll discuss the Scott Glass case. In that case, the last bullet point in my presentation, that these two criteria were evaluated, you know, dissimilar treatment, equivalent transactions, harm to competition, or is likely harm to competition or competitive injury. So Compact looked at these two criteria and said that even though there is a different pricing, you know, so for its loyal customers, Scott Glass was giving a better price, a lower price, and for the other customers, they were charged a little higher. But if you look at it, the downstream market, so the customer who buys this particular glass and then finally sells this glass to any pharmaceutical company, I mean, to the next player, you know, so basically to the next player, what is the price? I mean, is this guy really impacted, or are they all at the same price? So then Compact found that they're all at the same price. There is no harm or injury done. So I honestly feel that this is an important test that should be included in your abuse of dominance investigation. And while CCI is looking at relevant market, it's looking at whether a particular enterprise is dominant or not, but it also has to look at the harm, you know. So if by such a pricing, if by having a differential pricing, or by having a discount, or by having certain conditions under the contract, what is the harm or injury that is being caused in the market to the downstream players? If CCI has to examine that. There's also the recent case, I mean, there's a penalty, CCI has passed an order against Grasim, you know, which is a recent case, which is as in March, where a penalty has been imposed. And in that, and it has been held that Grasim has, you know, indulged in abuse of dominance practices. Now, in that particular thing, also CCI does not go into the effects based. Okay, so there, one of the conclusions was that the price was discriminatory, but actually, does the spinner really get affected? So once the spinner buys the fiber, and is the spinner affected? What is the pricing? So CCI has not looked into all of that. We'll have to see, because I mean, we'll have to wait either. I mean, I definitely think that a legislative amendment incorporating the appreciable adverse effect test into Section 4 is definitely required. Or if not, we'll have to wait and see how the Supreme Court lays, once the cases reach the Supreme Court level in terms of this test and whether it's important or because Compact has laid that down in one particular case, but we of course do not have, it's not like the law of the land. So CCI is bound by it, but a case from us, maybe a jurisprudence from Supreme Court would be really helpful to clarify, so whether this test or in what cases should CCI apply or not apply, because leaving it to the discretion of CCI where it applies on an ad hoc basis may not benefit all industry players. So yeah, I think that is all from my side. I'm done here. I think.
Okay, ma'am. So we can take questions now. Like
Okay.
anybody who has questions can put it on the Q&A window, and ma'am will be able to see it.
Yeah, I can see one question.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, there's a chat also. I don't know. Okay, yeah, sure. Mr. Prashant Raju, yeah, I can email the presentation.
Yes, ma'am, you can send it to us. We'll put it on.
Okay, so I have a question from Mr. Pratik Gupta. How do we evaluate the dominance of a new entrant in a market that is dominated by its group company? For example, GMR owns Rajiv Gandhi Airport, so it controls the entry of vendors, line management. Okay. So in terms of a new entrant, yeah, I think in terms of assessing its dominance, all these factors continue to apply. And actually, at this point, I think it's worthwhile to know the amendment, that is also proposed in the bill, is that the government, okay, no, sorry, not, sorry. No, in terms of dominant, for example, GMR owns Rajiv Gandhi. So, if its own subsidiary company is entering into the market, we can't stop someone from setting up a new airport, right? To provide any airport services, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But in terms of assessing, so basically the conduct will be monitored. So suppose, yes, if you have a parent and a subsidiary entity, controlling. So that's what I talk about vertical integration, So if the subsidiary also enters, so then GMR is controlling. Of course, it has, as I said, access to resources, enterprise, and it has access to capital and everything. And if it is controlling and it is not, if these two together do not allow a new third party to enter into the market or not allowing other players, to engage in the market on a fair and an objective manner, that is when the dominance would be an issue. So per se, dominance is not a problem. Being the only player, there's nothing wrong with it. It's your activities that is what would be prohibited. If you indulge in anti-competitive activity, that is you're abusing your dominance, I think that is what will be prohibited by the Competition Commission. So I hope that answers your question. Any other questions? Okay, yeah, okay, this Aishwarya, yeah. Do aftermarket effects also come under the purview of, okay, sorry, yeah. Do aftermarket effects also come under the purview of effects doctrine? Okay, do aftermarket effects also come under? Okay, here, so aftermarket effects, yes, definitely. So the entire auto parts case, right? It's your aftermarket. So after sale of a car, your entire services, your spare parts that are, that a particular consumer buys, all the automobile makers make maximum money out of that. Okay, so in that is where the relevant market has been defined so narrowly in the auto parts case, and and of course, we get to see the final decision on that. But okay, in this thing, right, the abusive covenants to agreement between developers. So there are two aspects. There are two regulators here. Okay, so one is anti-competitive thing, and the RERA also steps in. So your entire real estate regulatory authority, which has been set up, has, and in fact, you also have your Consumer Protection Act. Okay, so but of course, I think because RERA would take over here, so RERA will look into the fact of your covenants. So if like I know under the RERA Act, okay, so if you have unilateral interest payment clauses. Suppose if the buyer is not able to pay the money within the time, then the developer charges interest. But similarly, if the developer does not hand over the possession of the flat, there is no interest on the developer. Such unilateral clauses are frowned upon under RERA, and they are like, I mean, you can go to RERA to get them to get sort of a relief. So there is RERA to that extent. So once, if even so these, sorry, so if a developer is there, so the moment a developer is not dominant, your recourse is to go under RERA to go under, approach RERA and get your relief. Because I don't think Consumer Protection Act will apply otherwise, but you also have Consumer Protection Act. So if it's not a dominant player, and so there is, you are aggrieved due to actions of a certain market player, then of course you have your other regulatory bodies that you can approach and seek relief. That's my yeah. Any more questions? I mean, just to add, sorry. So basically, there's a lot of the whole jurisdictional issue, right, between CCI and other regulators, whether it's your TRAI, whether it's your RERA, whether it's your SEBI. So you do have a lot of regulators coming up. So even for the consumer protection, it's proposed that you'll have a separate regulatory body. So Competition Commission will have to work in tandem with these regulators. So I think recently there was another case I think in terms of international interconnection charges. Okay, so here it was a foreign entity which basically said that the prices that were being negotiated by all the telcos with this entity were were anti-competitive. So in that context, CCI, of course, CCI had approached TRAI and took their opinion, and after that it was held. TRAI said that there's nothing, it did not violate any telecom laws. So I think in such a case, when you do have a separate regulatory authority, we have to seek opinion of that regulatory authority before we conclude any sort of an anti-competitive, activity under the Competition Act. I think that's all I want to say.
So if anyone has any questions, can just send over in the Q&A column. Or if there are no questions, ma'am, we can just conclude our session here.
Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, it's a little weird to talk to this blank screen. But anyways, I hope this will, I mean, I really enjoyed talking. I obviously can't see any of you all, but I really enjoyed taking this session, and I wish you all the best. I think the only last piece of advice that I want to give all of you aspiring competition lawyers is that please ensure, that your foundation, one, in corporate laws. So when I say corporate laws, it includes your Basic Companies Act, your Contract Act, Transfer of Property Act, your Sale of Goods Act, limitation, specific relief. Please ensure that you continue learning and keeping learning and know what these acts are. So competition law is not it does not function in isolation. It works it works within your whole corporate law atmosphere. Okay, so please ensure that your corporate law knowledge is very thorough. The second most important thing is having the knowledge of economics. Okay, so to understand economics, how the market functions, the market dynamics function, the test, and inevitably in all competition law cases, there will always be an economist. Okay, so who will do the market analysis, whether it's your price, the correlation analysis, the causation analysis, the regression analysis. So once you have a good knowledge of economics, it becomes that much more easier. And lastly, please develop a thorough understanding of business. So pick up a sector, once you start working or whatever business that interests you, so start reading up about the business from publicly available information, track the top players, so if they are listed, so there'll be a lot of information that's available. There'll be market reports, so if you can get access to any of that, start reading articles on that sector, that are available in the public domain. So once you start doing all of that, so once you have a knowledge across, your corporate laws, your business and economics, I think, you'll be like one of those outstanding competition lawyers. I think that's the only advice I can give all of you as students, and which also has helped me because basically I'm a corporate lawyer. I have a solid background in corporate law, and then I moved to then I started learning competition law. I still do corporate law. So that this kind of foundation really helped me in learning and also adding value to my own business team and to any discussions that we have, when we go, and even when I meet senior counsel. So I have work with senior counsel like Gopal Subramaniam, P. Chidambaram, so even your Amit Sibal, all of them, at Supreme Court and Bombay High Court, worked with Mr. Darais Khambata and Janak Dwarkadas. These are primarily commercial lawyers, okay? So when you discuss with them, they'll always draw analogies to your basic, the basic commercial laws, to your basic corporate laws. So when they do, that's why I think it's very important that you have your foundation in corporate law is very strong if you really want to become a good competition lawyer. So wish you all the best and thank you so much.
Yeah,
I hope
that,
that session.
yes, ma'am, that is a great advice. Thank you so much for the session. This was a very informative session, and we would like to host in the future as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Bye.